So welcome everybody to tonight's talk. This is the second talk of a sort of project, we can call it, that includes two talks and an exhibition. And of course everybody's invited to come and visit the exhibition for the next 2 months with friends, but of course tonight. Harold in China, 1932-1939, photographs from the Acton collection. This is the exhibition. And if you I would say more than 1 year and a half, right? Because this was May 2017. Kristin Mahoney, who is our guest tonight, came for the first time to Villa La Pietra. But of course, she had already dived into the interesting subject that she will discuss tonight. Harold Acton, in a very specific, of course, chapter, Harold in China, but also seeing in some way what was his personality through his writings. So without spending too much time, I just want to introduce briefly Professor Mahoney, who is Associate Professor of English at Michigan State University. She has published essays on aestheticism and decadence in Victorian studies, criticism, English literature in transition, literature compass, 19th century prose, Victorian Review, and Victoria Periodicals Review. Her book, Literature and Politics of Post-Victorian Decadence, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, and she's currently working on a project, and this lecture, we're very glad to be the first, probably among the first, to hear the topic of this chapter. So her book is Queer Kinship After Wilde, Transnational Aestheticism and Family. So I think that before having Kristin talk, and I really again thank from all of us, and of course Ellen Toscano, who invited Kristin tonight to be part of the series, that's a museum meeting series that we organize for all students, faculty, and the outside public. I just want to start with a quote that I particularly like and fond, just to put up the floor. Every other country, this is from the Memoirs of an Aesthete, 1948. So Harold is back from China. He has to leave China, and we'll hear more of this in a second, in 1939, because of the breakthrough of the Sino-Japanese War in 1939. So every other country seemed to have been defiled to some degree by human beings. But this was improved, talking of China, by them. The Chinese were dominant blue notes in their own landscape, a vast encampment rather than a city. In London, the conditions of daily life forced a certain disintegration upon me. Here, my days began and ended without dispersal. I did not have to jerk myself into a special frame of mind, for I felt at one with the atmosphere and settled down easily, like a fish in water. I belonged to myself once more. Soon I was learning in Peking colloquial, which had become China's national language, though foreigners persist in calling it Mandarin. My teacher knew no English. And with this, I leave the floor to Kristin Mahoney. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Francesca. I wanted to start out by just saying thank you to so many people. Thank you to Ellen Toscana, Francesca Baldry, Alta Macadam, and Cristina Bellini, who helped to make this project possible and have assisted me with the research along the way. I also wanted to thank Lucia Ferroni for making the arrangements for my travel. And I wanted to thank Francesca and Farron Liu, who put together this beautiful exhibit, which is such a wonderful context for my talk. And I'm so excited to go back and look at it again. I looked at it a little bit this afternoon. So as Francesca mentioned, this is part of a larger project that I'm working on right now called Queer Kinship After Wilde, Transnational Aestheticism and the Family. And in that book, I'm looking at people with ties to late Victorian aestheticism and Oscar Wilde who are practicing the family, practicing kinship in radical ways in the early 20th century. And in every case, in every chapter, I'm looking at people who are doing that within a global framework. So in some way in which they're rethinking the family is inflected by their travel or their transnational contact. So that gives you a context for the way I'm approaching Harold Acton and his time in China, as well as his relationship to the idea of family. And before I begin, I want to apologize for my translation of the Chinese names and titles in this talk. I am a Victorianist by training, so this is very far outside my training. So I'd like to begin today with two images that reflect two contradictory tendencies in Harold Acton's approach to cosmopolitanism. The first is a picture held here at La Pietra of the attendees at Harold Acton's birthday party at his home in Beijing, circa 1933, which includes two young men with whom Acton entered into deep friendship and collaboration, and these are the two young men on the left here, and I'll be talking about them more. These collaborations, as I will discuss later, resulted in enormously important works of translation that participated in the emergence of a Chinese modernist aesthetic in the early 20th century. The second image is the opening of what I would argue is the central chapter of Acton's 1941 novel concerning transnational contact in Beijing, Peonies and Ponies, and that is the chapter entitled A Solitary Flower, a chapter that insists that only the globally mobile bachelor who has rejected marriage and reproduction can achieve the detachment and clarity necessary to enter into a true understanding of other nations and cultures. As I'll be discussing today, Acton's work exhibits a marked preoccupation with the value of solitude and detachment from conventional affiliation in the pursuit of cosmopolitan understanding. At the same time, he returns again and again to the idea that acts of voluntary or unconventional affiliation might engender cosmopolitan harmony and integration. To get to the point where I can properly discuss these warring impulses, however, I'll first need to discuss Acton's early influences, in particular the influence of British aestheticism on his practice of cosmopolitanism. British aesthetes such as Oscar Wilde and the queer aesthetic of the decadent periodical, The Yellow Book, inflected his development of a queer identity. And the British aesthete Walter Pater, whose conclusion to the Renaissance famously exhorts its readers to burn always with a hard and gem-like flame, to perpetually court new impressions, operates as the most foundational guide in his approach to transnational contact. So I'll begin with a discussion of Acton's connections with aestheticism, and then I'll wind my way back to his time in China, to these two seemingly contradictory artifacts of Acton's life in Beijing, with which I began. Looking back on his time at Oxford, the poet and literary critic Peter Quinnell, in his autobiography, The Marble Foot, recollects his impressions of his fellow student Harold Acton in the 1920s. Quote, "I entered the section of Oxford society that Harold Acton dominated. When he first arrived, he had been obliged to, quote, sport his oak against the attacks of furious Christchurch athletes who had smashed his windows and threatened that, should he reemerge, they would duck him in the fountain. By the time I appeared, however, he was already well on the way to becoming an Oxford institution. The son of American and Anglo-Italian parents, he had an impenitently alien look, the air of a Renaissance prince of the church and of a youthful Chinese sage combined. His voice was strange, dulcet, and elaborately mannered, and a suspicion of a stutter or trick of momentarily hesitating before he brought out his most pointed phrases gave his conversation added charm. That voice, I presently learned, he had inherited from the veteran actor Robin de la Condamine, and Condamine, in his turn, had inherited it from Oscar Wilde." Much of what I wish to bring out about Acton today is embedded in this single quotation. Quinnell is struck by Acton's cosmopolitan and hybrid identity, his status as at once impenitently alien and at the same time an Oxford institution, his heritage simultaneously American and Anglo-Italian, his air that braids together the Italian Renaissance and the Chinese past. He acknowledges the panic and rage Acton's sexual and gender identity inspired in the furious Christchurch athletes, and the dandyish manner in which he seems to have transcended that fury to dominate and guide a section of Oxford society. And in speaking, Quinnell notes, Acton channels the 1890s into the 1920s, operating as a medium for Oscar Wilde's voice and his manner of speaking, by way of the intonations of Robin de la Condamine, an actor famed for playing Herod in Wilde's Salome, uttering pointed phrases with striking charm, reproducing Wilde's epigrammatic mode, and replicating his oft-noted reputation as one of the greatest conversationalists of his time. Quinnell's Acton, the sexually dissident cosmopolite, who transmitted into early 20th century England the aura of China, Italy, and the fin de siècle past, is the Acton I will be discussing today. And I'll be focusing in particular on how the transnational and transhistorical network of influences to which Quinnell alludes underwrote Acton's attempts to move through the world uninhibited by familial obligations or national ties. As I will argue, Acton's work is preoccupied in large part with the freedom such an approach to existence engenders. Though at the same time, as I'll discuss, he's also very much alive to the loneliness that accompanies this kind of unfettered movement. In his fiction and in his memoirs, he highlights the discomforts and limitations with which he associates conventional kinship ties and fixed national identity. And he theorizes a dandyish and deterritorialized mode of being that facilitates mobility, perception, and pleasure. Oscar Wilde and Victorian aestheticism operate as important models as he works to extricate himself from conventional modes of kinship and desire. And in turn, his eschewal of conventional familial and national attachments sharpens his perception, disentangling him from the orthodoxies and allegiances that might delimit his capacity to engage with the cultural objects with which his global mobility brings him into contact. Aestheticism enables his detachment, and detachment enriches his aestheticism. In my talk today, I'll be foregrounding the role that Acton's ties to aestheticism and his travels in China played in his development of a queer vision of cosmopolitan bachelordom, the manner in which his interest in the aestheticism of the late 19th century inflected his response to China, and the function he, as a decadent modernist, played in the cultivation of Chinese modernism and the mentoring of Chinese poets and scholars in the 1930s and 40s. And I'll be referring to him throughout the talk as a decadent modernist, and that's a term I think a lot of people in Victorian and modernist studies are using now to describe these figures who sort of bridge the Victorian modern divide. We don't know where to place them in terms of periodization. While his move to China constituted a purposeful rejection of marriage and biological ties, it also inspired additional experiments in alternative modes of queer and transnational affiliation, as he worked to support the careers of emergent Chinese writers, forging intimate and collaborative bonds with the younger Chinese men with whom he came into contact in Beijing. In his life writing, Acton carefully constructs an image of himself that highlights his ties to Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, Aubrey Beardsley, and the sexual dissidents of the 1890s. These are, after all, the memoirs of an aesthete. Half of his friends, he announces in the book's opening paragraph, disapproved of the title. What, an aesthete? One of those scruffy, long-haired fellows in peculiar garb, lisping about art for art's sake? No, you'll prejudice all your readers in advance. Old Oscar screwed the last nail in the aesthete's coffin. He commences his memoirs then by announcing defiantly that he is well aware that in titling the text in this manner, he links himself to Oscar Wilde's trials for gross indecency, to lisping fellows in peculiar garb, and the decadent bohemianism of the 1890s. Immediately, however, Acton signals an additional allegiance, a commitment to cosmopolitanism, and the, quote, mutual exchange of ideas between the nations, ideas without national boundaries, and that's the terminology he uses. Other titles have occurred to him, he notes, such as My Quilted Coat, borrowed from a passage from Arthur Waley's translation of Po Chui's poem, The Cranes. Quote, the western wind has blown but a few days, yet the first leaf already flies from the bough. On the drying paths, I walk in my thin shoes. In the first cold, I have donned my quilted coat. These lines come to him because, quote, the western wind has been blowing on him with a vengeance since his return to Europe in 1939. This is a cold unlike any he experienced in China because there, quote, the genius of the Chinese people kept him warm, and in Europe, he has not been able to find a substitute. As much as he is an aesthete, Acton stresses in the opening of these memoirs, he is also a cosmopolite, one whose imagination strains beyond the boundaries of Europe. The recent war, he notes, has, quote, interrupted the culture nurtured by individuals like himself, citizens of the world, quote, forced into hibernation by the devastation and jingoism of World War II. It is time, however, he argues, for the cosmopolites to reassert themselves and remind their fellow creatures of, quote, what they are fast forgetting, that true culture is universal. In the midst of the booming and thumping melee of political voices rising in the wake of the recent war, Acton announces he will raise his gentle voice and advance an aestheticist vision. And the language he uses here is is drawn directly from Walter Pater's conclusion to the Renaissance. It's almost kind of direct quotation. For me, beauty is the vital principle pervading the universe. By contemplating the myriad manifestations of this vital principle, we expand into something greater than we were born. Art is the mirror that reflects these expansions, sometimes for a moment, sometimes for perpetuity. Here he speaks in the dialect of Paterian aestheticism, reflecting on art's capacity to, quote, expand the intervals of existence, to endow each moment with the highest quality as it passes, and beauty's ability to set the spirit free for a moment. "Peace on earth and goodwill toward men will only be brought about by individuals like myself," he states. Individuals who, with their focus on beauty and, quote, ideas without national boundaries, might expand beyond their nations to foster contact, exchange, and communication. In the opening pages of Memoirs of an Aesthete, Acton braids together his aestheticist heritage and its attendant associations with the queer subcultures of the late Victorian period and his deep cosmopolitanism, indicating that these are the characteristics for which he most wishes to be known and with which he most hopes to be useful in the years following the war. And when I was going back to the memoirs as I was going to write this, that was the thing that really struck me, is that that's the way he chooses to open this book, is by talking about Oscar Wilde and talking about cosmopolitanism. Those are the two most significant things. The image of Acton as essentially aesthetic, as almost biologically determined to be decadent, is driven home in the chapters that follow, as he details his early admiration for Aubrey Beardsley's, quote, cadaverous tall torches of women dying upright in pools of their own wax, dry lips parted hungrily to plunge into some forbidden fruit. His devouring of the picture of Dorian Gray like strawberries at the age of 12, and this is an image of Acton's actual copy of Dorian Gray here at La Pietra. His childhood contact with Wilde's close friend, Reggie Turner, who operated as a Wildean medium as his, quote, voice descended to the depths of an imaginary corpulence. His gestures became sculptured and hieratic, and his fingers sprouted scarab rings when he repeated Oscar's sayings. And the confiscation of his copy of Wilde's House of Pomegranates by a tutor who labeled him a moral leper. The memoirs reveal him moving purposefully towards the moral leprosy of decadence from his very first steps, as does his book collection here at Villa La Pietra, which includes a copy of Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol, marked by the bookplate that he used as a child, and a copy of Wilde's Intentions presented to him by his fellow aesthete Brian Howard as they left Eton together for Oxford at the age of 18. And this is just an image of one of the shelves here in La Pietra that's filled with Wilde's books, and this is one of many. So that was one of the things I was really interested to see when I came here, is just how much, he talks a little bit about moving away from the 1890s in the memoirs, but you can see how central they remained when you look at his actual book collection. Even more revealing of the deep imbrication between Acton's mode of camp modernism and late Victorian aestheticism is the Eton Candle, the bizarrely precocious periodical Howard and Acton produced collaboratively while at school. With its loud pink cover and its yellow end papers, and I actually went with Francesca to make sure that the end papers were yellow today. I read a description of them. They are, in fact, very yellow. With its loud pink cover and its yellow end papers, the Eton Candle visually enacted its desire to integrate the decadent aesthetic of the Yellow Book with the bombardiering modernism of Wyndham Lewis's Blast. And as Acton notes in his memoirs, the print was to emulate that of Max Beerbohm's early works, nodding reverentially to the Beardsley period productions of decadence's foremost surviving dandy, and his shelves are filled with the works of Max Beerbohm, another significant decadent as well. The contexts, too, were aggressively aesthetic, including Acton's Paterian short story, Hansom Cab No. 213, intended as the first chapter of a planned novel about a young man whose whole life was a meticulous study of harmonies, which sounds like a Paterian novel, described by Shane Leslie as Beardsley-ish. In addition, the two young men somehow managed to solicit an unpublished poem by the proto-decadent pre-Raphaelite Swinburne, as well as a set of contributions from the most outspoken and well-known decadent modernists of the period, the Sitwells. And it's just bizarre to me that they were able to do this in their teens, to kind of create this kind of strange decadent modernist artifact at such a young age. With this single issue, Acton and Howard announced their presence on the modernist scene as what Jim Knapp Fisher referred to as, quote, a pair of Oscar Wildes, a performance they would amplify upon their arrival at Oxford. Acton, in collaboration with Howard, developed a form of energetic and bombastic aestheticism to rival the defanged decadence on display at Oxford. Soon after arriving at the university, Acton encountered a form of post-Victorian decadence that read to him as inauthentic and exhausted. He writes in the memoirs that he was introduced to a sickly, quote, pressed fern from the pages of the Yellow Book, whose long hair and ebony cane only stressed his lack of personality. He made up his mind that if that eunuch represented Oxford aestheticism, something would have to be done about it soon. Now that the war was over, those who loved beauty had a mission. We should combat ugliness. We should create clarity where there was confusion. We should overcome mass indifference, and we should exterminate false prophets. To outdo and displace the decadent pretenders, he began fetishizing the early Victorian era, advertising himself as drawn to dawns, not twilights. While he performed at this moment a break with the fin de siècle, his memoirs, his fiction, along with the material evidence present in this very house, delineate a decadent genealogy for the larger-than-life dandyish persona he enacted at Oxford and into his years in China, indicating that late Victorian aestheticism remained a guiding force for Acton throughout his career. Rather than abandoning aestheticism, he remade it so it might continue to operate as a viable aesthetic during the modernist moment. In remaking and revising aestheticism, Acton was working to generate an alternative to what he referred to as the, quote, vaunted virility of the more masculinist modernisms prevalent during the period. For the sickly, impotent decadence Acton encountered at Oxford threatened to render aestheticism outmoded and unable to engage in true combat with ugliness. The machismo and brutish Englishness and Americanness of the high modernists engendered an aesthetic unable to engage with otherness. Speaking disparagingly of the Anglo-American, he calls them Bronco Bill modernists, he encountered in Paris, Acton noted how little they assimilated from their sojourn in France. They seldom penetrated French life beyond the aperitif stage. According to Acton, Hemingway, Ezra Pound, and Ford Madox Ford, in their, quote, tweeds and Stetsons, pugilistic sweaters, and ponderous pipes, simulated the cowboy and made a cult of the hair upon their chests in order to, quote, camouflage their timorous souls. And this is one of my favorite parts of the memoirs. In contrast to these timorous Bronco Bills, whose bravado masked their inability to penetrate or be penetrated by other cultures, Acton's new aestheticism would facilitate vulnerability and engagement with the wider world. Acton's aesthetically inflected cosmopolitan curiosity was expanding during this period further and further afield. As he indicates in his memoirs, his national identity was from the first highly liminal and hybrid. While he received much of his education in England, he remained, in his words, a, quote, un-English production. His childhood in Italy, surrounded by artworks, art magazines, and catalogs from France, Spain, and England, and what Martin Green has referred to as the, quote, lavish internationalism of his family style, which we can see on display in this room, engendered a mobile consciousness, perpetually seeking contact with other cultures and traditions, immune to nationalist sentiment. He notes in his memoirs how his cosmopolitan subjectivity shrank inwardly at the onset of World War I, as the, quote, pervasion of khaki began, that he was alarmed and depressed by the, quote, permeating ugliness, the bleak banality, the mushy, slushy sentiment of wartime. Patriotism, jingoism were for Acton abhorrent first and foremost in aesthetic terms, for the manner in which they restricted the consciousness and curtailed perception. His aestheticism, on the other hand, spawned unrestricted cultural curiosity. Following his departure from Oxford, his thirst for contact with other nations continued to expand, fueled in part by his hiring of a Chinese cook, Chong Sung. Delighted with his cooking, Acton, quote, banished European impediments and ate with chopsticks. The green tea that Chong Sung served him, quote, induced a greater serenity, and suddenly he was, quote, half in China, and as time went on, he wished to be wholly in China. For if one Chinese could render existence so agreeable, what couldn't some 400 millions do? When he returned to Florence, he was unable to bring Chong Sung with him, but Acton notes he had, quote, watered a seed long dormant within him, an innate love of China beyond rational analysis, and an instinct that he had some vocation there. Until I went to China, my life could not be integrated, and this is the term that he used that I think is so interesting. Delay in going to China made me impatient of Europe. I remained outside the European scene, a too impartial observer. So it was during this period, dining on Chong Sung's food, growing impatient with Europe and the vaunted virility of masculinist modernism, longing for the integration that was to occur once he finally arrived in China, then Acton wrote Humdrum, a novel that provides much insight into the manner in which cosmopolitanism and the rejection of conventional domesticity were intertwined in his imagination. And I don't know how often this book is read now, but it is incredibly fun, and I would really recommend it, and I wish it was still in print, because I would probably teach it if it was. Acton himself felt the novel to be a failure, and he was very ashamed of it later, expressing embarrassment at his attempt at popular fiction in later years. And it was critiqued by Cyril Connolly at the time for being too thoroughly enmeshed in the decadent aesthetics of the fin de siècle, and this is a quote from his review. One can never be quite sure, while reading Humdrum, whether one is looking at the present day from the decade of the Yellow Book, or from the present day at the arid literature of Roman vice. I'm nevertheless interested in this text as a barometer of Acton's feelings concerning familial affiliation and national identity in the years immediately preceding his departure for China. Humdrum tells the story of two sisters, the highly cosmopolitan and dandyish Linda, and the highly conventional and wholesome Joan. While Linda jet sets around the globe, Joan remains in England, dreaming of being, quote, tied by the bonds of holy matrimony to her beloved Michael, who stood for, quote, order, convention, tradition, for the Conservative Party, jingoism, and the empire. Following their marriage, Joan and Michael visit Linda in Venice, where they're outraged and befuddled by Linda's fashionable set, and made to feel, quote, parochial and provincial. As they depart, Joan shudders with resentment at the manner in which Linda waves them off to their, quote, dimmer and shabbier world of vulgar commonplace and dull routine. stirred by a, quote, impulse akin to patriotism welling within her to stand up loyally for the things she had chosen in life. So she feels patriotic about her conventional domesticity. The novel insists over and over again on the linkages between mindless heteronormativity and mindless patriotism. When they return to England, Michael and Joan name their newborn child after vulgar jingoism's official mascot, Rudyard Kipling, but the allure of Linda's lifestyle is nevertheless not so easily expelled. Joan finds the staid and settled domesticity she had championed in opposition to Linda unfulfilling. Childbirth, despite its mortal danger, proved to be, quote, painfully dull and painful and dull. She begins to wonder if she is, quote, too much in the clutch of matrimony and what it represents. Michael's friends, plum cake and lemonade, responsible maternity. I feel I'm missing things. There is a void. Sensations leave me out since my marriage. I would so love to have sensations, one after another, as many as possible, odd new sensations such as Linda has had. Domesticity and child rearing are set in opposition to aesthetic Epicureanism and the Batarian quest for new sensations. As her quotidian existence grows increasingly tedious, Joan attempts to mimic Linda's more adventurous lifestyle. She has an affair, begins to wear rouge, and mingles with her sister's bohemian set. When her husband and child die tragically in a fire while she's attending the opera with Linda, which is very unfortunate, she then throws herself entirely into hedonism, and the final chapters of the novel detail her slide into utter dissolution as she becomes the concubine of an unattractive Hollywood producer. Joan's attempts to transcend her provincial and puritanical imagination end in failure. Her mind, distorted by adherence to convention, was unsuited to an Epicurean existence. As much as she tried to shed the traces of her highly conventional past, she remained tainted by dull patriotism and dowdy domesticity, unable to successfully maneuver within a cosmopolitan life of pleasure. Linda, on the other hand, retires to rural Scotland with her handsome husband, Jack. She sometimes finds the country dull, but after a life of endless indulgence, she is somewhat fatigued and welcomes the rest. She is unsurprised by Joan's fate. While she should have been a womb woman by rights, rearing a handsome British family, suckling and nursing the plant-like growth of many children, one had foretold all along how Puritanism would end in such a case. It was, the novel insists, Joan's Puritanism, her naivete, that made her so vulnerable to dissolution. Linda's cosmopolitan sophistication allowed her to negotiate a life of pleasure unsullied. The thrill the text offers lies in watching the ruin of a smug, parochial, and heteronormative prig. Acton almost cruelly grinds Joan into degradation while rewarding her dandyish Epicurean aesthete foil with a long vacation in the countryside. The text is somewhat vicious and at times, I guess, a little bit misogynist maybe, but it provides much insight into Acton's thinking immediately prior to his departure for China. In an interview with Naeem Hatala in 1990, Acton stated that his father would have, quote, preferred me to marry and have children, but I never had that desire. I never had a feeling for children and family. And he says things like this throughout his writings. In reading the memoirs, one gets the feeling that the pressure to settle and succeed had become particularly acute following his departure from Oxford. He was given, he notes, 3 years to, quote, make good. Humdrum indicates his escalating exasperation during this period with conventional trajectories of maturation and reproduction, as well as his equation of family life with provincialism and small-mindedness. His queer mentors, such as his uncle Guy Mitchell and the decadent modernist writer Norman Douglas, advised him to slip the noose of this narrative. Douglas encouraged him to, quote, get out of Europe and go to the Far East. Mitchell, who in Acton's words sympathized with his wanderlust, offered the necessary financial assistance, and in 1932, he departed Europe, not to return until 1939, save for one brief interval. When Acton arrived in China, quote, an immense calm descended over him. He felt strangely at home. This was the integration he had so longed for while in London, an integration that depended upon his extrication from home and from family. In his memoirs, he indicates that he came increasingly to believe that his capacity to truly see and experience China, to encounter the space and the culture in aestheticist terms, and perceive his surroundings with the finest senses, depended on his eschewal of companionship. He notes that he began to heed the advice of the Buddhist Sutra, let one who would obtain freedom from desire and follow his own will wander alone like a rhinoceros. He asserts, quote, entered upon the way to perfection. The pleasures of companionship diminish our powers of observing and delighting in what we see. To pass most swiftly from point to point and be present always at the focus where the greatest number of vital forces unite in their purest energy. One must wander alone. Integration in and with China demanded solitude. He, quote, resolved to keep aloof from Europeans who did not share my enthusiasm for China, which at the time meant the majority. As his integration with his surroundings proceeded, he came to be viewed by his fellow Europeans as, quote, another regrettable case of a chap going native, which further reinforced the boundary between himself and the expatriate community in Beijing. And in his own eyes, he grew increasingly keen and lucid in his perception. As he, quote, savored the symmetrical calm of his courtyard where everything was perfectly proportioned, his European past came to appear thinly frivolous. At last, I had ceased reaching outward, ever outwards, in an effort to express myself. My real adventures flowed inwards, smooth and fecundating. Veil after veil which had blurred the light was withdrawn. I had never been so powerfully lucid. All deceptive mirages melted before my visionary eyes. Not that I saw things merely as they were, I saw them as they had been and as they were becoming. This is the Paterian climax of the memoirs, Acton alone in his courtyard in Beijing, achieving an apex of aestheticist perception, withdrawing entirely into himself and thereby seeing with the greatest acuity the Heraclitean flux that surrounds him. Acton's Peonies and Ponies, completed after his return to Europe, theorizes and interrogates the processes of withdrawal and cosmopolitan integration Acton underwent in China. Attempting to parse the distinction between vulgar Orientalism and cosmopolitan curiosity, as well as the connections between aestheticist individualism and voluntary affiliation, Acton constructs a character, Philip Flower, that operates as a reflection upon, and at moments, a caricature of his own mode of existence while in Beijing. Philip's retreat from England into an aestheticist reverie in China allows him to extricate himself from the sexual and gender ideologies of England and develop a queer identity as a man without nation or family. While the novel does think critically about British consumption of Chinese culture, it also considers whether Flower's, and by extension Acton's, more authentic and aestheticist mode of appreciation for the beauty of Chinese culture truly brings him into closer contact with the city of Beijing. The novel at times seems to lampoon the very notion of authentic transcultural engagement, casting Philip as misguided and foolish in his attempts to integrate himself into China. So in his representation of Philip, Acton investigates the ethical and political foundations underwriting his own practice of cosmopolitan bachelordom, as well as the sacrifices and alienation this practice necessitated from him. And he considers the extent to which aestheticist perception might enable transnational contact, as well as the possibility that queer kinship practices might engender alternative modes of connection and community. The novel opens by foregrounding the distinction between Philip's aestheticist cosmopolitanism and the superficial Orientalism practiced by the majority of Beijing's expatriate community. Picking such loads of fun, asserts a Mrs. Mascot, there's always a delicious spice of the unexpected. Philip sneers in derision at her incurious idiocy and barbarity and thinks in contrast of, quote, all the city had meant to him, of the manner in which everything about him continues to appear supernatural and brought grist for pantheistic reverie and wonder. What were the feelings so copiously aired of a Mrs. Mascot in comparison with his? What right had she there? She and her polypus type were profaning all of his sanctuaries. Had he not seen her with a party of tourists who had motored, actually hooting their horns, up to the Temple of Heaven? He juxtaposes this vulgar form of tourism with the ecstasy he experienced within the, quote, spiritual isolation of those walled precincts, foregrounding his capacity as a detached, solitary, and refined aesthete to enter into real communion with the holy sights and beauty of China. Departing Mrs. Mascot and her what he calls jabbering circle of Europeans, he muses to himself that he feels, quote, as if he were married to Peking, and this marriage was to be an inexhaustible adventure. Philip, the text signals immediately, believes he has been brought into a more authentic intimacy with his surroundings, eschewing conventional modes of affiliation, so he may be closer married to the city. The novel signals very clearly that Philip understands himself to be engaging the city through an aestheticist framework. He moves through Beijing in a Paterian manner, reading the landscape through a Wildean lens. Gazing upon a goldfish, for example, in the city's central park, he asks, is it not like Salome dancing the dance of the seven veils? And calls his companions to see Salome is dancing for us. Admire the variety and originality of costume displayed by that chorus, the mannequin with crimson corsage and silvery train, and this one in moire silk, which in certain lights becomes a mantle of diapered gauze. The text indicates that Philip links his aestheticism and detachment to his capacity for acute perception, which renders him alive to the city's beauty, perpetually readied for ecstatic encounters and the composition of decadent lyric responses to Beijing wonders. So in this chapter that I referenced in my opening remarks, A Solitary Flower, Philip reflects on the peculiar hybrid identity and isolation engendered by his enthusiastic veneration of China. His Britishness, he acknowledged, separates him from the Chinese, yet he is too Chinese for the foreign community. This leads to a certain degree of loneliness. He, quote, loves the city to distraction, so why, he wonders, did he suffer from these bouts of solitude? During these bouts, he longs for connection and intimacy. Quote, he wanted to meet the Chinese on their own ground and be accepted as one of them. He would have liked nothing better than to be adopted by a Chinese family. His quest, however, for a, quote, Chinese friend has thus far been unsuccessful. Fellow expatriates encourage him to, quote, find himself a fleshly mate, but Philip insists that is not in his line. To remain alive to the city, he insists, he must remain a solitary flower. Despite his avowed investment in solitude, Philip quickly turns to the construction of an alternative familial structure that might, he hopes, bring him into true intimacy with China. While wandering the streets alone, he ducks into a theater, and in a scene that mimics Dorian Gray's encounter with the actress Sybil Vane, he is, quote, stirred by intense curiosity at the sight of an actor whose, quote, timid little steps mimicked the gait of a girl whose feet had been pinched into the tiniest of slippers, and whose eyes were animated by a hard flame of lasciviousness that was scarcely feminine. Acton expressed a deep fascination with the female impersonators of the Chinese stage, celebrating them in his memoirs for their decadent capacity to triumph over nature through artifice. This fascination is similarly reflected in photographs of Li Shifang, the little Mei Lan Fang, making up, and of 6 female impersonators in the role of Pan Shen Lian in famous Chinese plays, and in the photograph of Mai Xianglin as Chen Xiang, the maidservant in Qian Nu's spirit journey taken on the porch of Acton's residence in Beijing. In Peonies and Ponies, it is the female impersonator who operates as the potential antidote to the loneliness and longing for integration with China that beleaguers Philip Flower. He sends the actor Yang Paoqin his card and requests an interview. As he awaits the actor's visit, he generates a queer kinship scheme that might counteract his isolation. The thought struck him, why not adopt a son? He would need a companion in his old age. In his first interview with Yang, he endeavors to demonstrate his cultural links with Yang and his need for companionship. He stresses his connectedness with China. My body is foreign, but my soul is Chinese, he says, as well as his isolation. I have no family. I am alone in the windy, dusty world. He tells the actor that this year promises to be the happiest of his 15 years in the country because he has met a new, quote, young friend. The novel represents Philip's fascination with Yang as shifting and complex, motivated at once by erotic desire and the need for companionship. During the initial interview, Yang sings for him and, quote, sparks flicker before his eyes, his ears are on fire, his insides melt away. Following the actor's departure, he contemplates the photograph Yang left behind, relying on Wildian and Paterian tropes of bewildering and enigmatic feminine beauty to delineate the dizzying impact of Yang's gender dissidence on his consciousness. He examined Yang's photograph. It was as baffling as The Sphinx, which is an Oscar Wilde poem, as the smile of Mona Lisa, which is the subject of the most famous passage in Pater's The Renaissance. The stocky youth with close-cropped hair was hard to reconcile with the delicate beauty he had become, full of strange feminine ardor. Filled with longing for this mystifying figure, Philip schemes to bring Yang into his home, but these attempts are rebuffed by Yang's teacher, Mr. An, an opium addict to whom Yang had been sold by his grandmother. When An is arrested while trying to purchase opium, Philip sees an opportunity, agreeing to bribe the teacher out of prison, quote, on one condition, that Philip could have custody of Yang in the future. An is instead executed, and Philip is finally able to achieve his greatest desire and take the grieving Yang into his home. The new domestic arrangement appears at first to be at once ideal and erotically charged. When Yang begs to perform his, quote, filial obeisance to his new father, Philip's, quote, heart begins beating almost audibly, and he went a little wobbly on his knees. The arrangement does not, however, live up to Philip's aesthetic expectations. Yang's grandmother reappears on the scene, demanding to cohabitate with the, quote, father and son, and Yang declines to self-exoticize to Philip's satisfaction, and instead exhibits signs of a, quote, Occidental mania, refusing to don the Chinese gown and claret silk Philip presents to him in favor of a Western suit, and decorating his room with a photograph of the Empire State Building. In reaction, Philip slides even further into excessive cultural appropriation, and this is where I see Acton sort of caricaturing himself, satirizing his own approach to integrating with China. So he does this in order to try to convince Yang of China's aesthetic appeal by mirroring it back to him. So, quote, "A double transformation thus took place. While his Chinese protege was striving to westernize himself, Philip was gradually turning into an extinct type of Oriental. He grew a mustache, which he trained to strangle downwards with a special comb, and he let his nails develop into scholarly talons. Philip's attempts to model the appeal of Chinese culture are not successful, and he grows increasingly disappointed by his attempts to integrate with China via his connections with Yang. This connection is further endangered by Yang's grandmother's insistence that the boy must marry. Philip inquires of Yang if this is his wish, and the boy's response, that first he would like to be taken abroad by Philip, renews Philip's hope in their bond. Quote, "Yang clasps Philip's hand and shakes it with all his might. 'I love my daddy,' he atones in English, eliciting tears in Philip's as he muses, this was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him, the moment he had waited for all his life." And that is by far the weirdest scene in the novel. This ecstasy is fleeting, however, as Philip comes increasingly to realize that Yang's Occidental fetish cannot be overcome. As the text concludes, the Japanese occupy the city, and Philip retreats into the study of Buddhist scripture, while Yang ceases to worry him, moving into a pleasant niche in the background of his consciousness. In the novel's final passage, Philip returns to withdrawal, isolation, and detachment, leaving the burning house of this world and becoming a confirmed recluse. As he chants in Sanskrit, Yang's grandmother shouts at the servants, and the radio of his adopted son whistles and brays. But Philip, transfused with the mellow light of imperishable truth, does not hear. Peonies and Ponies is somewhat pessimistic in its treatment of cosmopolitanism and transnational engagement. While it is certainly the vulgar expatriate community that the novel subjects to the most ridicule, the text also expresses deep skepticism concerning Philip's belief that he, in his solitude and his aestheticism, has somehow managed to truly commune with Beijing. His queer kinship scheme also fails to bring him into direct contact with Chinese culture, as Yang refuses to enact the kind of cultural purity that Philip demands. The novel's conclusion, which echoes the Beetarian climax of the memoirs, and it sounds a lot like that scene of Acton alone in the courtyard, finds him withdrawing back into himself, perhaps reaching nirvana, but more likely operating according to another Orientalist delusion. This in turn raises questions about the representation of that key moment of integration in the memoirs, gesturing towards the possibility that Acton himself doubted the effectiveness of his practice of detached and solitary aestheticist cosmopolitanism. The novel as a whole, I would argue, expresses cynicism about the possibility of true transcultural encounters. In the final section of this talk, however, I would like to turn to Acton's collaborative and mentoring projects as a counterpoint to the dim satirical representation of transnational contact in Peonies and Ponies. And this allows me to return to the photograph of the birthday group at Acton's home in Beijing. Included in the photograph are two of Acton's students in China, Chen Shixiang and Li Yi She, or Shelley Li, and those are the two on the with whom Acton completed significant collaborative translation projects. In his memoirs, Acton details the pleasures he experienced while serving as a lecturer on English literature at Peking National University, at a moment when the university had become the, quote, cradle of the Paihua movement to promote a new literature in the spoken language. Acton thrilled at this contact with this emergent Chinese modernist movement, and he notes that this night in particular, when his students presented him with an engraved shield and Chen played the flute in the garden, was the moment when he, quote, realized in every fiber of his being that he was in the China of all his reveries. I will close then by considering the possibility that Acton's collaboration with these two students, which I will argue represent significant achievements of transnational modernism, represent an alternative path to cosmopolitan engagement. Chen Shixiang and Acton collaborated in the production of modern Chinese poetry, a collection that places contemporary Chinese poetry within a modernist framework, arguing in a fascinating introduction that while Chinese poetry had, quote, long been wilting in a Rococo cage, the modern poets of China wished to emancipate themselves from tradition. This is a collection that highlights the avant-gardism of Chinese poetry, celebrating the, quote, force, agitation, and speed of Kuo-mojo, the concentration of Chinese poetry that produces, quote, a total effect to which only a few of our imagists have approximated in English. So throughout the introduction, they're sort of positioning Chinese modernism as more modernist than Anglo-American modernism. And it works also to foreground the extent to which the successes of these poets emerge from transnational forms of cross-pollination. In their introduction and their short biographies of the poets, Chen and Acton center the influence of symbolism and decadence on modern Chinese poetry, the fruitfulness of these poets' contact with Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and Arthur Symonds. This collaboration seems to have been the product of a friendship marked by deep mutual admiration and true intimacy. Acton notes in his memoirs that he was, quote, sustained as a teacher by the silent sympathy Chen expressed in the classroom. And he devotes great attention to Chen's attractive physical appearance. Quote, his full lips, friendly brown eyes under strongly marked eyebrows curved upwards, his expression full of candor and mobility. The correspondence between Chen and Acton at the Beinecke Library bears similar markers of intimacy and affection. In a February 22, 1940 letter, for example, following Acton's departure from China, Chen narrates his deep longing for contact with his absent teacher. This is the letter up here. I have been desperate to know your whereabouts. Yes, desperate is the word. 5 letters I have written, all missed. 2 years thus elapsed while I was disappointed, wondering, despairing. Last summer, I saw Mr. Wen Yaoning in Hong Kong and was told that you were still in Peiping. I confessed a pleasant surprise, but did not write at once, thinking what with the Japanese censors, what with the other inconveniences, there might be difficulties for my letter to reach you. 3 years absence, a dreadful long time. During this, I have been teaching in this nomadic university and have learnt nothing but to suffer. Now when I write feeling somehow sure that you may receive the letter, I don't know how to begin and how to end it. All thoughts have been so long dammed up and words fail. How I long to see you on this fine February morning to let this heavy lump leap out of my throat. Acton's friendship with Shelley Lee seems to have operated at a similarly intimate pitch and similarly resulted in a cultural object that should be understood as a triumph of transnational decadent modernism. The collection here at La Pietra includes photographs that Lee presented to Acton with warm annotations. To Dear Mr. Acton, yours ever, Shelley Lee. And there's letters in the collection at the Beinecke as well that are similarly intense. I miss you greatly, and a sort of unspeakable melancholy assails me when I feel that I am almost forlorn and desolate here. So these are written at a very, very intense pitch, these letters between Acton and his student. Lee and Acton collaborated in the translation of 4 cautionary tales, which they published under the title Glue and Lacquer in 1941, accompanied by a set of stunning and strange erotic illustrations by another decadent modernist, Eric Gill. Eric Gill is the chapter, or the subject of one of the other chapters in my book, so I'm really interested that Acton and Gill are coming together here. The title, Acton notes, comes from a common Chinese metaphor for the closest of human intimacies. And Gill's illustrations highlight the story's preoccupation with embodiment, sexuality, and desire. While the translations rework stories first published in the 17th century, Arthur Waley's preface to the collection, like Acton and Chen's introduction to modern Chinese poetry, works to position Chinese literature as fundamentally and essentially modernist. Chinese fiction, Waley argues, integrates prose and verse in a manner similar to the opening part of E.M. Forster's Passage to India or the novels of Virginia Woolf. In fact, when Woolf, quote, took to detaching certain passages of a more lyrical kind by printing them in italics, she was becoming almost Chinese. Lee and Acton's translations work similarly to foreground the lyricism of the source material, the modernity of the fiction that hovers between prose and poetry, and they transmit unabashedly the eroticism of the original tales. In a letter to Acton at the Beinecke, Lee expresses concern that English audiences will be troubled by the story's erotic content. But he also stresses his conviction that this content ought to be preserved in their translations. Quote, I wonder what repercussions these Feng Mang Lung edited stories will have on the super refined and somewhat squeamish English reading public. It always strikes me that if the sensual side of the picture is wholly toned down, the whole thing will degenerate into sort of dull didactic sermons. In the end, the sensual side of the picture was not toned down, and Glue and Lacquer stands as a stunning example of the integration of decadent modernism and Chinese aesthetics, a model of cosmopolitan cultural production emerging from transnational collaboration and intimacy. And there is a copy of this Glue and Lacquer down in the exhibit. I really encourage you to take a closer look at the Gill illustrations, which are amazing. So which story is true then? Which assertion in Acton's eyes is correct? Is cosmopolitan communion fundamentally impossible? Or to penetrate other cultures, must one remain disconnected and entirely alone? Or can transcultural understanding occur within queer networks when globally mobile bachelors enter into contact and communication with aesthetes and scholars abroad? I have told you already what Peonies and Ponies concludes, but Acton ends his memoirs on a markedly different note. The memoir's final paragraph describes a painting of Acton by Madame Lo Chang with a calligraphic description. quote, a believer both in Christ and Buddha, you harmonize in yourself their various teachings. And Farron has actually translated this a little bit differently downstairs. I encourage you to take a look at it because I think the contrast is interesting. In this, Acton writes, her intuition has penetrated one of my cherished ideals. Towards that harmony, I still continue to strive. This final paragraph reveals Acton theorizing cosmopolitanism in terms of process rather than achievement, a harmony to which he must perpetually continue to strive. I would argue that Acton's skeptical treatment of cosmopolitanism in Peonies and Ponies is as crucial a component of that process as the collaborative projects into which he entered with his students from Beijing. His willingness to question his own motives, his own methods, and train his acute perception on the manner in which he strived for harmony means he kept always before his eyes the potential failings of cosmopolitanism, continually monitored his own practices for Orientalist tendencies. While Peonies and Ponies might center upon the failure of the Cosmopolitan project, the intimate friendships and collaborations that resulted from his time in China must be understood as exemplars of cosmopolitan engagement. So what I've tried to demonstrate today is the extent to which Acton's fiction and his life writing at once hold and question the value of both detachment and intimacy when working towards transnational communion. And they insist that communion is at the same time impossible and the highest ideal. Thank you.
I have two questions for you. One, when you were talking about Humdrum, I was struck by, we always think about Harold Acton as, to what extent did he or did he not inspire characters in Waugh's novels, and whether the women in Humdrum were inspired by people that you knew, whether the Mitford sisters, for example, were possible inspirations for the two women in the novel.
That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that at all. But yeah, that is a really interesting idea. And yeah, it is interesting that you mentioned Waugh, because the part of the reason I think Humdrum did so poorly is it came out at the same time as Decline and Fall. So that Cyril Connolly review I was showing you, it compares Humdrum and Decline and Fall, and partially it just uses Humdrum and kind of dismissing Humdrum as a foundation for explaining what's so wonderful and perfect about Waugh's novel, which is really unfortunate, because I think the book is actually wonderful and funny, but because of this review and some of the other feedback he received, he just thought, I can't do that kind of popular fiction, and I think he was actually kind of good at it.
My other question was about that remarkable quote from Harold Acton from 1990. You, in your slide, it said that it was from an interview, and I was wondering where that interview appeared.
I found that online, and it was linked, I believe, through a site devoted to Evil and Waugh, actually. And I can look for that. I came across it when I think I was just doing searches for things about Harold Acton and family, Harold Acton and children, to see if there was anybody else who had talked about this. So I was really happy when I was trying to make this case about his investment in Bachelordom to see something that explicit talking about, his aversion to marriage and children. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Corey, think of modernist Chinese literature and art. You think about a lot of Chinese literature and art looking towards Western modernism. All that happens much more in Shanghai than in Beijing. And it seems like Harold Acton was going to old China, so to speak, and avoiding business communities in Shanghai, and also Shanghai had, at that period, had even exhibits of Mexican revolutionary prints, of German expressionism, and things like this. So he really seems to be completely oblivious to this other world, which is much more connected to the trajectory of European or Western modernism.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because that's what I think is what they're trying to do in He and Chen in the introduction and the biographical notes to that modern Chinese poetry collection is to sort of hover between sort of insisting upon the fundamental and authentic Chineseness of the poets that they've collected there, while at the same time highlighting the moments where they see evidence of the kinds of influences that I think Acton wanted to see, right? Like I think he wanted to be able to say, when these poets are really successful, they're practicing. He's particularly interested in the collection in some of the urban poetry that he compares to Arthur Symonds, and he wants to say, oh look, this poet is kind of mimicking Arthur Symonds, and these read like the London Knights poems, or they're kind of inflected by Mallarmé. So there is this way in which he wants to kind of position these works as fundamentally in opposition to English and American forms of modernism. But when he wants to make the case that they're doing the things that he likes the most, he's oftentimes using these examples drawn from this kind of British decadent or decadent modernist tradition to make that case. Yeah.
Well, one thing that strikes me is also that, in a way, he was escaping from Florence and from the strictures of his family, and he ignored also the cultural background that Italy was going through at the time.
Sorry, what was the last part?
The cultural climate, because modernism was not totally known in Italy even in those years, during the 20s and 30s, and he seems to take a very distant look toward that, as if by going to Beijing he was, eschewing the Shanghai vivacious climate and really wanting to go back. His interest, perhaps testifying to his interest in times past, also in his historical works, the Bourbons in Naples, etc., etc. So I think that there was also some kind of distance from Italian culture, which he evidently wanted to avoid at one point.
Mm-hmm. So you're asking about his kind of desire to sort of extricate himself from Florence at the
From Florence and from his family, obviously.
Yeah, that's going to be the larger framework for the chapter, and the way that I'm conceiving of it is that then in this final part of the chapter, what I'll go on to talk about is the difficulties he has in terms of negotiating the relationship to the family when he is kind of forced to come back to Florence. Because I think I'm interested in the figure of the bachelor as someone who's able to reject marriage, reject reproduction, and that way reject conventional family life. But then in some ways, because of his bachelordom, that makes him more vulnerable to getting sucked back into this space and becoming the caretaker for this home, which he talks about in such a kind of vexed and complicated way. And of course, he has such a strange and difficult relationship to his father, and to become then the kind of caretaker for his father's legacy, I think is a very, very difficult thing. So that's the kind of move I want to make as I move into the final part of this chapter, is talking about China as an escape from Florence, but then it's unsuccessful, that he is rerouted back into this space and forced to become part of the conventional, part of the biological family again, the thing he most wanted to distance himself from.
One other thing, I don't want to monopolize all this quote. I don't want to, take full stage. But I mean, one other thing, you said the legacy of his father. That's true, but we know very well that it was his mother's background and connections in the United States, and his father had his own side of marriage. But I mean, it would be interesting also to try and understand what type of relationship he had with his mother. And by exploring books in the library, we found notations, Cristina Bellini can testify to that, comments that the mother was making about a passage in a book, and Harold commented on them in another copy, I think, which was very, very amusing, very telling in a sense. So even the relationship between father Harold and his mother would be interesting.
No, that's a wonderful point. I think that there's that Martin Green book, The Children of the Sun, and one of the cases he makes about this group of men that he's interested in, that includes like Harold Acton and Brian Howard, is that so many of them have this incredibly vexed relationship to their fathers, but then this much more sympathetic relationship to their mother. So I do want to think more about Acton's relationship to his mother and what was happening there. But it seems like even though he felt so much closer to her and so much more sympathy for her, this wasn't a happy place for him. I think in part because of the role that the father played in governing it. Yeah, thank you for that, that's wonderful. Yeah.
I'll ask you another question. Okay. There's a little comment in that world, from the art point of view, that world of China, the world of Beijing at that point. And, there's Lawrence Sickman there, there's Lawrence Roberts, who writes a lot of things about Japanese art, was living in Beijing at that time, and was also, they became the first director of the American Academy in Rome. And a number of all these people were all these bachelor Western men, both Americans and English, and there must have been other communities of them too from other places. But there was also at that point kind of a mother hen for them all. And there's this woman whose name is escaping me right now, but who was English American, and she, if you went to Beijing, she would set up, she'd find you the house, she'd find you the servants, she'd find you all these things. She became a great expert too of Chinese furniture. So if you go to Kansas City, which Lauren Sickman was the director of, all the furniture, Chinese furniture there, comes through her in one way or the other. And then she left, I think she left before the war too, ended up and lived in Nantucket for the rest of her life. So it's an interesting thing to try to figure out this other world and how all these guys kind of organize themselves, because there was definitely this other mother figure.
Interesting. That's really wonderful. Thank you. I want to know the name of this person. And I'm wondering if she's satirized at all in Peonies and Ponies, if she shows up there. But there's a recent book, and I'm forgetting the author's name right now, but Lily Briscoe's Chinese Eyes, that's on China and modernism, that sort of talks about the relationship between the circle of men and Chinese culture, and the ways that their links to China were so central to their practice of modernism. But I would love the name of this woman. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Being authentically interested. Yeah, that's such an interesting point. So it comes up. It's in spots in the memoirs where he's kind of citing particular principles from Buddhism and talking about the way that they guided his approach to living in China. And then I think it's very significant that becomes Philip Flower's conclusion at the end of Peonies and Ponies, right? That all of a sudden he's kind of becoming incredibly, he decides he no longer cares about having this sort of at once erotic and familial relationship with Yang. The thing that becomes important is chanting and achieving some kind of enlightenment in that way. And I don't know what to do with the fact that the more closely I read that novel, the more I read it as sort of satirizing Philip Flower. So that makes me wonder how much he endorsed Philip Flower's move into this kind of Buddhist withdrawal that he's talking about at the end of the novel. In terms of the correspondence that I've been able to look at, I haven't found anything that talks explicitly about his investment in Buddhism. And I would love to look at more, but everything that I've seen so far, I haven't gotten any kind of key to exactly how sincere and authentic this is. But I think that conclusion to the novel makes me hesitant. But then at the same time, the conclusion to the memoirs, right, that he's including this quote about him kind of integrating the teachings of Christ and Buddha. But
and in the inscription, right, that we saw that's in the exhibition, was even father, wants to follow the picture, the idea of connection to the earth.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it.